In this chapter, we will discuss planning your research project. First, you must decide what is your overall research design. This is the overall structure for your study. You need to think about the procedures that the researcher, which in this case would be you or theoretically you, in terms of the proposal. You don't actually have to conduct it. The data the researcher collects and the data analysis the researcher conducts. First, we want to think broadly about the problem of interest, what you want to investigate in your study. First, we want to think about the people, and in this case, it could be people or even animals. What types of people, what ages, certain groups, certain ethnicities, certain socioeconomic status distinctions. What about the people that you're interested in studying is important and relevant to your study, if you are in fact working with people or animals. Sometimes we're working with things, inanimate objects, especially in the hard sciences, where they're looking at rocks or vegetable life, plant life, etc. Sometimes we're just dealing with records. We're dealing with records that have already been collected. We're going into the archives and pulling out records to try to understand perhaps some historical perspective. Perhaps we're looking at patterns over time and we can look through records. Sometimes we're thinking about thoughts and ideas. How do people perceive the world around them? Perhaps we're thinking about how do they describe it even in poetry, political cartoons. Are there any patterns there that become important and relevant for that time period? And then dynamics and energy. A lot of times in human interaction, social behavior, we're interested in how we react to each other, respond to each other, and even in plant life, how does plant life respond to light, certain different types of light, direct light versus indirect light, etc. Next, we need to plan a general approach. We need to think about the kinds of data you need to address your problem. How are you going to find participants? How are you going to sample them? And perhaps we don't need to sample participants if we're conducting an approach that is related to archival research, right? If we're looking at records, do we even need to find participants? No, in that case, we just look at the previous records. Do we have the right equipment and skills? For example, some tests require certain types of equipment to be able to analyze different responses. For example, if we're looking at brain activity, there are certain, whether we need an EEG or an MRI, or do we have the right equipment? Sometimes it's just a matter of skills, not even equipment. But if we're, for example, interested in intelligence tests, well, we need a certain type of training to be able to administer intelligence tests, and perhaps we'll need to hire professionals such as psychologists to do that for us. So if we don't have those skills or equipment, how are we going to go about finding those or acquiring those or hiring people to fill those gaps? And then, are we going to be able to interpret the data and draw conclusions from them? And that will be based on the extent to which we understand the appropriate statistical analysis or qualitative analysis that is appropriate for the type of research question that we have. Next, we need to plan and then determine our methodology. So in planning, we need to determine the general approach to the study. This may or may not be similar across disciplines. In most of the social sciences, the process is similar. In the hard sciences, such as chemistry, biology, physics, there's more of a sequential step that we need to go through in acquiring our data. But we need to start to plan how are we going to conduct our study. And with that, it involves defining our methodology and the techniques used to collect data and analyze data, and it may be specific to our particular academic discipline. So for example, if I am a biologist, I will not be conducting a qualitative study, right? So what we're doing will really depend on the types of data that are appropriate for our particular discipline. The nature and role of data in research. Well, data are pieces of information that help us form a bigger picture. Data are transient. What is true at any time point may not be true at another time point. So we have to understand that data that we collect is only giving us information to add to the weight of evidence. So we're not just proving or disproving hypotheses. Actually, we do not like that type of terminology. So we never say if our statistics are significant that we've proven a hypothesis. We're actually only contributing to the weight of evidence. And the reason that we need to be cautious in our wording is because they're only pieces of information. And those pieces of information that we gather may be due to other factors, such as extraneous variables that may have affected our results. It may be due to the particular cohort that we're utilizing in our study. It may be due to the setting that we used in our study. And it may be due to other fluctuations that change over time. So whatever we find, we need to be cautious in the way in which we interpret that data and not to overstate our findings. Data can come in two forms. We have primary data and secondary data. Primary data is the data that comes from the source. So what we can actually gather from the source itself, from the participants of interest. Secondary data, on the other hand, is derived from the primary data. So the primary data exists, but in trying to understand that data, we need to perhaps make some assumptions, piece information together to be able to understand the original data source. And there could be reasons for that. In your book, they talked about a car accident and what actually happened. I think that was a good example in saying even though you have the primary source, even the primary source may not give you or be able to give you an accurate picture of what happened. So I really like that example that they use. It's actually on page 77. And the reason that I like that example is because we have the source, right, which is the driver. And yet we're not able to piece together what actually happened because other things happen in the process of being in a car accident that impact your ability to truly and accurately represent the incident and describe the incident. So therefore, in that case, the only thing that we can do is piece together, based on the evidence, which way the car went, what evidence is left at the scene. Maybe we can take some physiological tests and see, did you recently have a heart attack or a stroke or a seizure, and then go back and piece it together. So I really like that example, and you can look at it again on page 77 in distinguishing between primary and secondary data. In your planning process, you need to decide what type of data are needed. One of the first things that I want you to consider is, are you going to collect qualitative or quantitative data? So qualitative, we're talking about words, those are interviews, having people write responses, those are more qualitative data. Quantitative data, we're trying to quantify our variables of interest. The next thing we need to know is, where are the data located? The data may be located in archives, or we may need to derive that data. So for example, if we're looking at depression scores of inpatients, maybe we need to go to an inpatient facility, we need to assess them, have a formalized assessment, maybe hire people to do those assessments, and then collect that data. So what is that process? Where is it located and how are we going to obtain it? And what limits will be placed on the nature of acceptable data? So in every instance, there are certain limits on what we can or cannot collect. There can be an ethical limit. There could be a situation in which there is a gatekeeper that doesn't allow us access to the data. So how many participants do we need to be an acceptable research study? These are all things that we need to take into consideration. And then lastly, we need to begin to think about how it will be interpreted. And one of the things that you really want to think about here is not only what type of data do you have, but what type of analysis are you planning to utilize? And did you set up your data in a way that allows you to conduct that particular type of analysis? And as you get more into statistics, and we'll talk a little bit about it this semester, that will really allow you to better plan out your study and better plan out the way in which you want to collect it so that there is a possibility to be able to analyze it. Linking data and methodology. So we talked already about the types of data. I talked about qualitative and quantitative. Well, for each of those types of data, they have their own respective methodologies. Quantitative methodologies were involving collecting numerical data and then obviously analyzing that numerical data. Qualitative methodology were involving textual or image-based data that we're interpreting, coding, categorizing. And then a lot of methodologies use mixed. So an example is collecting survey data, so we're administering surveys, and then also interviewing those participants that we surveyed, or conducting a focus group interview or a one-on-one interview. And then we have the numbers that we can analyze and interpret. And then what's really wonderful about mixed methodology is then you can use quotes or examples or themes that you found to then explain what it is that you found in the quantitative results. To determine your approach, you need to ask yourself several questions. What is the purpose of your study? What is the nature of the process? So what is that process going to look like over time to be able to actually conduct your study? What are the data like and how are they collected? So what is your approach? How are you going to collect qualitative data? Are you going to collect quantitative data? If you're going to collect quantitative data, for example, in my previous example, I talked about depression scores. Well, there are so many depression inventories, depression scales. Which one will be utilized in the study? How will we select that to be used in our study? Is it appropriate for the age range? So if I'm working with 5-year-olds, I'll probably use a different scale than I will use with my 20-year-olds, and they have children's scales and adult scales. So these are all things that we need to start thinking about early on. And then again, how are the data going to be analyzed? Thinking about the analysis way before you even collect data, because you want to make sure that you collect data in a way that is appropriate for the analysis that you're thinking about using. And then thinking about how are your findings communicated. A lot of times, depending on the type of design, but we present it at research conferences, professional conferences, in your own discipline, in journal articles, etc. You also have to consider several other issues. What is your comfort with the assumptions of the qualitative tradition? There are a lot of people, researchers, who want hard figures, numbers, and the qualitative tradition, there is more interpretation that is involved, which then involves more of the bias from the researcher, and a lot of researchers are weary about this type of tradition. That's one thing that we need to think about, right? How comfortable are you with that? The audience for your study, who is the audience? And how do you need to present your data in a way that is appropriate given your audience? You need to think about the nature of the research question. What does it involve in terms of process? What does it involve in terms of, is it a good question? Is it one that's testable? We also need to then substantiate that research question or hypothesis. We need to utilize the literature to support that hypothesis. Now, it can do it in several ways. It could perhaps support it in saying that this is what we are likely to find. It can also be used to show that there's a gap. So we can provide the relevant literature that's related to the topic and demonstrate how there's this gap in the literature, and we want to, address this gap in the literature by conducting this study. That's another way in which you can substantiate your research question. You need to figure out the depth of what you want to uncover or discover. So how much detail do we want? How much data are we going to need to collect to get to that depth that we're interested in? And then there are always logistical concerns. So how much time do we have available for conducting the study? Are we on a time constraint or not? Funding, a lot of times, is an issue here as well. In addition, we need to think about the extent to which, especially if we're working with people, willing to interact with the people in your study. Will our interaction with the people in the study affect our results in any way? The extent to which you feel comfortable working without structure, depending on the type of design. You know, experimental, true experiments have a lot of structure, where some of the, like a phenomenological study has very little structure. It's more a free-flowing, allowing the data to emerge. So that will also depend on the type of design we consider. And then your ability to organize and draw inferences from all of this information. Can we piece it together? Are we collecting data that we know how to analyze? And then, of course, writing skills, because then to be able to communicate that information is going to depend on the extent to which we are equipped to write in our discipline as well, because with every discipline there's a different language, different vocabulary, and are we familiar with that vocabulary in a way that allows us to truly communicate to other people in our discipline. Okay, now we need to select a research methodology. And in your textbook, you have a chart that reviews all of these types of methodology briefly. On page 84, you can go through it as well on page 84, but let me talk to you a little bit about each of these studies. An action research study is a study in which you are conducting something that needs to be known today by real people. So for example, I know some of you work in schools. Let's say you're working in a school and your principal, or maybe you are the principal, needs to investigate a certain problem. Let's say we got a grant, and the grant is going to allow us to buy iPads, but we want to know the effectiveness of the use of iPads in the classroom. And maybe we need to take a subsample of students because the grant was only partial, and then it involved lots of funding from us. And before we invest all of that money, we need to know if it's effective. So then we conduct an action research study to test its effectiveness before we then, we got this grant, now we have to invest more money. So before we do so, we want to know for sure whether or not the funding is worth it. That's a perfect example of an action research study. So it's a research study, but the purpose is to solve a real-world problem. A case study, typically we're looking at one individual or several individuals, or like a group. So you can take a case study and just look at learning more about University of South Dakota students. So the University of South Dakota could be the case versus an individual. So a case study can either be an individual or a group, an individual group. And then we're just trying to learn more about that one person or one group, and we're investigating further. Primarily, we're working with qualitative data, but you also have a body of statistics for what are called single-end designs that can help you investigate and process your data for case studies. Content analysis is a type of qualitative study that we're looking, and it's typically qualitative, although there are categories and coding schemes that allow us to make it more quantitative. And we're looking at content. So for example, if we're looking at the content of television programs, and is the content more positive or negative, and then we're trying to, we define some categories that we're interested in looking at, and then we look at various programs and we see the extent to which it's positive or negative. One example are children's programs, and looking at the extent to which children's programming is violent or non-violent, educational or not educational. And so then we can look at the content, code it. So there are ways of coding it quantitatively, but we need to develop a really strict coding scheme, and then create our analysis of the content of whatever it is that we're looking at. Correlational research, we're looking at the relationship between two variables. So what is the relationship between anxiety and self-esteem? What is the relationship between test scores and number of hours studied? So correlational research, you have two variables, and that we call those bivariate correlations, where you're looking at two variables at a time, and we're looking at the pattern. Is there a positive relationship? As one goes up, the other goes up, or also as one goes down, the other goes down. That's also positive. Or is it negative, where they're going in opposite directions? As one goes up, the other goes down. As one goes down, the other goes up. That would be a negative correlation, or no correlation at all. And so if those are the types of questions you're interested in, then a correlational research design is best for that. Design-based research is looking at educational initiatives. And so what they do is they try to take empirical educational research and theory-driven qualitative research, and together they use it to piece together and understand how and why educational innovations work or do not work. So this design is really specific to educational practices and the effectiveness of those educational practices. Developmental research is looking at development over time. Typically, developmental research, well, not just typically, but it should be longitudinal in design, because if we're looking at development, we're looking at how people change over time. And when we're looking over time, the most appropriate developmental strategy is to follow individuals over time. Now, there are instances where we compare cohorts, so first graders versus third graders, but true developmental design is longitudinal in design, where we follow them over time and see how they developed over time. An ethnographic study is looking at the culture or the experience of a particular group of people. So when we think of cultures, we typically think of, what we talk about in society as cultures, ethnic cultures, but really we can talk about the culture of city life, right? The culture of the bar scene, the culture of farm life. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an ethnic study, but an ethnographic study actually has expanded largely to looking at all sorts of cultures, not just ethnic cultures. In experimental research design, which is next, is we're looking at establishing causation. We need to really strictly control all other variables. We have one independent variable, and we're looking at how the independent variable affects our dependent variable. Independent variable is one that the researcher manipulates, so the researcher is in control, and then he or she controls all other variables and makes sure that the dependent variable is only influenced by the independent variable and nothing else. So in a true experimental design, again, we're looking at establishing causation. So if I were to investigate the effectiveness of a study strategy on test scores, what I'll typically do is give one group the study strategy, the other group no study strategy, and then look at their test scores. And in this case, I would also have to control all other factors. I have to make sure that the instructions given to both groups are the same. We need to make sure that the room environment is the same, the heat, the temperature, the color. Everything else in my study needs to remain the same except for the study strategy I gave to one and the no study strategy I gave to the other. The test has to remain the same, and then I can make some comparisons. So here, there's a high element of control, and the researcher is manipulating the independent variable. Next, ex post facto research. Here we're talking about research that is conducted after the fact. It's after the fact in that the data has already been collected. The data is not being collected by the researcher. The researcher is looking at, for example, archival data, and it's already been collected. So for example, if we're interested in the diagnosis of autism over time and we're looking at how it's related to maybe some ethnic factors, SES factors, well, instead of just figuring out all the people who have been diagnosed this year, I can go back in the archives with permission, of course, and investigate how those diagnoses were made over the past 10 years. Now, that's not something I would want to do today, right? I would want to go back, look at the archives, and see how it's been done. So that would be an example of ex post facto research. A grounded theory is a qualitative design in which we're trying to develop a theory. So it's all about theory construction. You're trying to find themes, categories, patterns, and trying to see how they come together to then substantiate a theory. Historical research, we're looking, again, back in time, and we're trying to interpret what has already happened. So maybe a historical event, like for example, 9/11. Maybe we want to investigate what happened, interpret the reactions of people who lived in New York at the time. So it's a historical event, a historical time period that we're trying to go back and try to understand. An observational study is another design. And in this design, we are observing a phenomenon of interest. And there are different types of observational design, some with less and greater control. So we can either control an environment, ask participants to come in and observe some behavior of interest. For example, let's say we're interested in book reading behaviors of 2-year-olds with their parents. We want to see how parents are reading to their 2-year-olds. We can go to where 2-year-olds and parents are, like the library. That's a natural setting. Or we can create a laboratory situation in which they have some books and some toys, and then at least the number of books and the number of toys are controlled for, and the types of books are controlled for, and then we can look at the way in which they interact with their children during book reading. So that's an example of observing an observational methodology in which you observe your participants. A phenomenological study is when we're interested in investigating a phenomenon of interest. It is one of the most, I would say, open methods of the qualitative study, because we're just interested, you're purely interested in understanding a phenomenon. You're just asking questions, doing interviews, finding themes, but you're just purely interested in understanding a particular phenomenon of interest. A quasi-experimental research design is a variation of an experimental research design. There are many reasons why we conduct them. One of them might be an ethical reason. So let's say, for example, what we said in a true experiment is we need to control the independent variable. Well, there may be times when you can't control the independent variable. So, for example, there may be an ethical reason. So, for example, I can't ethically tell one group to smoke and the other group not to smoke and see what happens. I cannot ethically do that because we know that there is a link, there is a pattern there. We haven't established a causation, but we know there's a pattern there. It might be harmful to subjects, to participants, so we wouldn't want to do that. So that would be an example. Or if we want to compare males versus females, so we can control everything else. But that IV, the independent variable, we really can't control, right? We can't control gender. So those might be some examples in which you'd want to conduct a quasi-experiment. And then survey research. Survey research is any research study in which you utilize a survey method, meaning you develop a questionnaire and have individuals respond to that questionnaire. It's completely self-report data, typically, although you can have a survey in which they rate a sibling, a parent rates a child, or a spouse. But it comes from the source where they respond themselves. Next, we want to identify the validity of our study. Validity basically refers to accuracy. Are our findings meaningful? Are they credible? And there are different types of validity. One type of validity is internal validity. This is the extent to which the design of a research study allow the researcher to draw accurate conclusions about cause and effect. So this type of validity, internal validity, is specific to experimental research design. And for them to be able to establish the cause and effect, the IV having an effect on the DV, we need to control everything except for the IV. So in this case, it was, in the case that the example I mentioned earlier, was looking at study strategy versus no study strategy. Well, they needed to control everything else, right? So they needed to control the environment, the situation, the instructions, the person administering the test. And the greater that we do that, the more we're able to see the sole effect of the IV on the DV. So the ways that which you can increase internal validity: controlled laboratory experiment, a double-blind experiment, so even the people administering the study, so not only your participants don't know what it is that you're interested in investigating, but also your experimenter, your research assistant, doesn't know what they're investigating, they're just following the instructions. That's a double-blind. Unobtrusive measures, where you're not actually interacting with the people, so you're doing it in an unobtrusive way, and that way it is more of a accurate illustration. They don't know that they're being recorded, and you're more likely to have higher accuracy of your results. And then finally, triangulation, which just refers to having multiple sources of data. So not just self-report data, for example, but you also want data that is from, for example, if we're looking at parent-child interactions, we want information from the parent, information from the child, maybe from a third party, from another family member, to really triangulate and see if you're having a similar pattern. Now, although internal validity is most important in an experimental study where high control is necessary, you can also look at the extent to which you have internal validity in other studies. The extent, for example, in the differences between males and females, it's not a true experiment, but we can still try to control everything else except for what it is that we're interested in looking at the differences of. External validity is the extent to which you have generalizability of your findings, and the extent to which you can generalize the results of your study to the larger population is determined by the extent to which it's representative. So you'd want a representative study, that the setting is the same as the setting to which you're generalizing, and there are some strategies to increase external validity. Some ways to increase external validity is to conduct study in a real-life setting. So one of the goals with external validity would be able to apply it to that setting is to have a real-world setting. So if you find something in a laboratory setting, the question we have to ask ourselves is, would we find that in their environment? So the example I gave earlier of book reading behaviors, and we set up the laboratory situation, well, we need to ask ourselves, would we have found that if we went into their home or just observed them in the library setting? So we have high levels of control, but we don't want to have so much control that we lose sight of how people really interact with each other. So this specific type of external validity is also referred to as ecological validity, the extent to which it applies to that real-world setting. And so you'd want to see maybe what it's like in different contexts, and again, you want a representative sample. We're also interested in validity in qualitative research when we're collecting, verbal sources of data, for example, and we want to, again, be able to triangulate our information, compare it from multiple sources. So, for example, I conducted a study where I was looking at peer relationships and intimacy, and several other factors. And I not only asked individuals, but then I interviewed their friends, and I surveyed their friends, and then I triangulated the data to also have, again, greater accuracy and validity to my findings. We also want to make sure that we analyze anything that's outside of the norm, those outliers, and be able to explain any contradictory information and really describe it as best as we can. And with qualitative data, as I mentioned earlier, we need to address our personal biases. So we are the tool by which the data will be analyzed. And with that, we have our own biases because we're looking for certain things based on our hypotheses, our research questions. And based on those research questions, we want to make sure that we don't only find what we're looking for. And so one of the ways in which we can control for those biases is to, one, seek respondent validation, take it back to the source, the people you interviewed, for example, and say, okay, these are the themes I came up with. What do you think? Does this seem like what you were trying to communicate to me? Another thing is to have multiple coders or multiple people providing feedback, looking at the data, looking at your interpretations, and just verifying whether or not they see those same patterns that you saw. Now, as researchers, we need to define what it is we mean by every term that we're using. And the way in which your author talks about measurement, and here's his definition, their definition, they say limiting the data, measurement is limiting the data of any phenomenon, substantial or insubstantial, so that those data may be interpreted and ultimately compared to a particular qualitative or quantitative standard. So in the next couple of slides, let's talk about each of those aspects of measurement. Okay, so first and foremost, we're limiting the data of any phenomenon, substantial or insubstantial. Let's talk about what those mean. Substantial, having physical substance. Insubstantial, existing only as concepts, ideas, opinions, feelings, or other intangible entries. So we want to limit the data of any phenomenon, whether it has physical substance or it's something that we need to quantify, operationalize, explain, something that would be considered in your author's wording insubstantial. So we have to limit it so that, let's look at the next part, so that those data can be interpreted. So we need to be able to take those and transform them into new discoveries, revelations, or enlightenments. And what that means is that we need to be able to take that data, whether it's, what I would call concrete or more subjective data, substantial or insubstantial, so that we can then interpret that data. So we have certain methodologies and procedures for analyzing that data. The next part, we need to be able to, for it to be compared to a particular qualitative or quantitative standard. So we want to know what are the norms, what are the averages, conformity to the expected in statistical distribution. So now we're talking about the assumptions of different statistical tests, goodness of fit, accuracy of description. Well, there are certain standards in qualitative research, there are certain standards in quantitative research, and we need to fit within those standards when we're designing our study, collecting our data, and analyzing our data. Okay, so here's an example. We're measuring interpersonal dynamics in a small group. We can ask each person, who do you like most? Who do you like least? Who evokes neutral feelings? We can also allow the researchers to identify patterns and draw conclusions. So here we need to ask ourselves, well, is this something that's maybe more concrete or something that's more allows for more ambiguity? So we need to really, going back to operationalize those variables in a way that allows us to be very clear about how we are defining these variables of interest. And then what does it mean to like someone the most? What are you asking me about? What I like about how they act, about how they talk, about how they're a good friend or not a good friend. So you need to be really clear about what it is that you're asking them to rate. And then we have to be able to draw patterns and identify conclusions. And that's because identify patterns and draw conclusions. And the reason for that is based on the way, again, in which we collect data, it will then influence the type of analysis that we can conduct. So if I had asked each person and it was more of a qualitative, can you describe it, tell me more, that would be more of a qualitative analysis. And then that would allow me then to, perhaps conduct a phenomenological study. If I instead did a rating system of who do they like the most, the least, who evokes neutral feelings, maybe I'll ask them to rank their friends. It would have what's called ordinal data, and we're going to get into scales of measurement in a bit. So the type of data I collect, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and then if I have quantitative, what is the scale of measurement of the quantitative data? And based on the scale of measurement, what type of analysis can I do? So next, let's talk about scales of measurement. Scales of measurement tell us more about the type of data that we have. It also dictates the type of statistical procedures, if at all, that we're allowed to use based on the scale of measurement. So let's go through them. The first is the nominal scale of measurement. Here we're measuring data by assigning names or categories. So examples are nominal scale is boys versus girls. We'd also call this a dichotomous construct because there are only two. But you can have more. And both of these examples are dichotomous constructs, but another nominal scale of measurement would be ethnicity, and we can have multiple categories, year and school, and so those would be nominal scales. We're assigning categories. And so for this, we can only look at modes, percentages, and you can also conduct a chi-square test. Another scale of measurement, the second one, and there are four, is rank ordered. So one has higher, lower, less than. Now, the key here in how this is also, so nominal and ordinal are considered qualitative types of data, qualitative variables. And the reason, and with nominal that makes sense, right? Qualitative, distinct categories, males versus females, different ethnic groups. But with ordinal, there are a lot of questions with this one because, well, I'm naming them first, second, third, fourth. However, what you're not doing is saying that there are any specific equal proportions between first and second. So your first place, second place, third place can all be within milliseconds of each other if we're talking about runners in a race. But perhaps your next ones are, minutes afterwards. So we don't have equal proportions between ranks. Or let's say I'm asking, what is your favorite flavor of ice cream? Well, maybe you have two, that you really, really like, and now you have to assign one to be the first and one to be the second. But really, they're both the same to you. Or maybe, there's just one flavor you absolutely love, and the rest you could care less for. But you still have to give a different one a two. So you clearly know what's the one, but the two is like, in your mind, really far from being anywhere close to your favorite. So when we're talking about rank ordinal data, we're not talking about equal proportions between them. We're just ordering them. And so here, another example, elementary school, high school, college, graduation, in terms of how much education have you had? You can rank it. Unskilled, semi-skilled, or skilled. Well, there's a lot of variability within those, right? It's not concrete, but there is an ordinal scale of measurement. And then the types of statistical procedures that are appropriate with ordinal scale are median, percentile ranks. There's also a Spearman's rank order correlation that can be implemented. And the next two, interval and ratio scale, are quantitative variables. These quantitative variables, we have equal units of measurement. The distinguishing factor between interval and ratio scale is that with an interval scale, there's what's called no true zero. And the textbook talks about a 0 point is established arbitrarily. And I like to say there's no true zero. Zero doesn't really make sense. And proportions don't really make sense. So for example, a depression scale is on an interval scale. So rating scales, surveys, etc. are all on interval scales. What does that mean? So if one person has a score of 50 on depression and another person has a score of 100 on their depression scale, we cannot say that the person with 50 has half the depression of a person with 100. The proportions don't make sense. We also can't say that someone with a 0 has no depression whatsoever. It just means that was where their score lied, but it doesn't mean that there's the absence of it. So that's the distinguishing factor between interval and ratio scale. And we're going to talk about ratio in a second. And the statistical procedures that you can use are mean, standard deviation, Pearson product, moment correlations, and a whole host of others. Okay, so as I said, interval and ratio are very similar. The big differentiating point is the equal measurement. So equal measurement units, we said that's the same as interval scale. But here there is an absolute 0 point. So for example, distance, miles. If I walk 2 miles and you walk 4 miles, you walk twice as many miles as I did. If I'm interested in looking at the amount of vegetables purchased by college students, Well, I can compare that using pounds, right? I can say, well, you bought, half a pound of vegetables, and the other person bought a pound of vegetables over the course of, I don't know, you can give it a time period, a week. And so then we can make some comparisons and say, well, the person who bought a pound of vegetables bought twice as many vegetables as a person who bought half a pound of vegetables. And in this case, we can identify proportions. So ratio scale is very similar to interval scale, except that it has a true zero. And if I bought 0 pounds of vegetables, I didn't buy any vegetables. And so a zero makes sense. There is a true zero. And the ratio can express values in terms of multiples or fractions. And again, we have the same, mean, standard deviations, Pearson correlations, and others that you can calculate with interval and ratio scales. So in summary, these are our 4 scales of measurement. Nominal scale, one object is different from another. We create categories. Ordinal, one is bigger, better, first, second. We have some ranking system. Interval scale, one object has so many units more than another, but again, even though the proportions are similar, we cannot make proportion statements. Like if I have a 50 and you have 100, that you have twice as much than I do. But ratio you can. One is so many times as big or bright or tall or heavy as another, and we can make those proportion statements. If I bought 2 pounds of apples and you bought 4, I bought half as many as you did. So we start talking about validity. Validity is the extent to which a measurement instrument measures what it's intended to measure, the accuracy. Reliability, on the other hand, is the consistency. So the consistency with a measurement yields a certain result. There are different types of validity. Face validity is the extent to which it looks like it's measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. So if I have a depression scale and I'm asking, do you feel sad? Do you feel, lethargic and moving kind of slow? Those sound like, even to a novice, that they are measuring what they're supposed to be measuring. Face validity is not a concrete way of measuring validity, but it's one of the first ways in which we begin to establish validity before we even start to create further analysis. Content validity, on the other hand, is the extent to which a measurement interest is a representative sample of the content being measured. So face validity, even a novice should be able to see it. Content validity is really looking at the extent to which an individual who is a professional in the field would say that the content within that actually represents what it should represent. So, for example, if I'm asking about SES, and so I need to find, educational level, income, social status, and I am measuring all of those aspects to have a measurement of socioeconomic status, well, that seems accurate. Now, if I'm asking them, what's their favorite ice cream, what's their shoe size, that doesn't have content validity, right? It has to be related to what it is that you're measuring. And the content is also more of a subjective measurement, but it has to be measured or evaluated by someone who's an expert in the field. 2 other forms of validity are criterion validity and construct validity. Criterion validity is used to predict future or current performance, and it correlates with test results from another criterion of interest. Your textbook said it was the extent to which the results of an assessment correlate with one another in a related measure. There are types of criterion validity. We can look at predictive validity, for example, the extent to which the SAT is predictive of college GPA. That would be a type of predictive validity. That's a criterion that we're using. It could be concurrent validity, the extent to which scores on a new measure relate to scores obtained from an established measure. So the criterion in this case is, let's say I'm developing a new depression scale, and I have one that's already been established. I create mine, and then I correlate it to the already established scale. The idea is that you're taking a criterion and relating it back to another assessment. Construct validity is looking at the extent to which an instrument measures a characteristic that cannot be directly observed but is assumed to exist, such as intelligence. This becomes very important in the social sciences, psychological research, sociology, etc., education, because a lot of times we're utilizing things that are more abstract, motivation, anxiety, depression, and in these measurements, we can't measure them with inches and pounds, weights, etc. So we need to make sure that we're measuring the construct of interest. There are two subtypes of construct validity. One is convergent validity and divergent validity. They're both types of construct validity. Convergent validity, you say, okay, what should this be similar to? And then we correlate those two variables. So for example, let's say we have a math test, and we might correlate scores on our test with scores that also purport to evaluate basic math ability. So therefore, the scores on both of those should converge, and we should be able to say, yes, it's measuring what we are intending to measure. Or discriminant validity, where we're looking at that they should be different from each other. So sometimes we have variables that are similar, but they're different. There's a fine line between them. And so we can say we're measuring different underlying psychological constructs that should be different, and so the scores should not be correlated with one another. That's discriminant validity, again, a type of construct validity. And in this case, we would say, let's say we have a depression scale and a stress scale. Although there may be some overlap between them, maybe someone under high stress may become depressed, they are still evaluating two distinct constructs, and they should diverge. And so we want to make sure that we establish discriminant validity, which is also, again, another form of construct validity. There are many ways of determining validity. There are table of specification. The researcher constructs a two-dimensional grid listing the specific topics and behavior that reflect achievement in the domain. There's also a multi-trait, multi-method approach where two or more different characteristics are each measured using two or more different approaches, and the two measures of the same characteristics should be highly related to each other. So there are lots of different ways of assessing validity. Let's talk about one more. The last one is a judgment by a panel of experts. So I've been, in my examples of each type of validity, talking about all these different ways. But in the example of content validity, does it reflect the content? Well, that would be by a panel of experts to scrutinize and evaluate whether or not it's valid. And then reliability. Reliability is looking at consistency with which a measuring instrument yields a certain result with the entity being measured hasn't changed. So we want to make sure that we're reliable over time. We're reliable between time periods, that our results are consistent, regardless of who's administering the test. And so when we create instruments, they're designed to measure maybe social or psychological characteristics. They're even less reliable than those designed to measure physical phenomena. As you can imagine, it's much more accurate and consistent to measure something with a ruler or a scale, as long as the scale is calibrated. But when we're rating behavior or scoring rating scales, we need to be sure that we're consistent and objective in the way in which we're measuring those more abstract constructs. There are types of ways in which we can establish reliability. One is called inter-rater reliability. This is simply the extent to which two people are rating it the same way. So, for example, when we're rating art portfolios, for example, you have a panel of experts, and they each rate the art portfolio a little bit more abstract, indirect way of measuring, and we want to know the extent to which we have reliability between the raters. We also look at, let's go back to the observational study, when we're conducting observational studies, we want to have multiple raters who are observing the behavior, and we want consistency between the ways in which they're coding that behavior. So if we call it on-task behavior in a classroom versus off-task, are our coders, our raters, rating them reliably, and we can look at percentage of agreement between the two raters, and there are a variety of inter-rater reliability techniques that we can employ. Test-retest reliability is the extent to which a single instrument yields the same results for the same people on two different occasions. So we want to know, are we consistent even over time in our score? So we give the same test, exactly the same to them over time. We don't do anything else to them. And then we check if we have the same score, if it's reliable over time. And some are very stable in terms of test-retest reliability. For example, IQ is very stable over time. And so we'd want to assess the test-retest reliability. We can also look at equivalent forms reliability. It's the extent to which two different versions of the same instrument yield similar results. So let's say we have form A and form B. Well, they're both measuring anxiety, and we want to make sure that they're doing so reliably. So we measure those two forms against each other and then evaluate the extent to which we have similar results. And then lastly, we have what's called internal consistency. This is the extent to which all of the items within a single instrument yield similar results. And there are a whole host of reliability analysis that we can do regarding internal consistency. One, for example, is called a split half procedure, where you take half of your data, half of your scale, and we just take the score for half of the scale and then the second half of the scale, and we correlate it, and theoretically those two should be consistent with each other, that we're measuring the same thing in the first half of the scale as we are in the second half of the scale. And that just gives us the indication of how reliable our items are with each other. There are ways in which we can enhance reliability and validity. Our main goal here is to reduce error, reduce bias. There are some strategies for increasing reliability. We can standardize the procedures, establish clear criteria, train the researchers well. That's why we want that inter-rater reliability really accurate. We want to make sure we standardize every single step so the instructions are the same given every time. We can also increase validity, consult the literature, share drafts, conduct pilot studies, and always when we're using instruments, look at the reliability and validity information and make sure that it's reliable and valid for your population of interest. So let's say, for example, it may be reliable and valid for college students, but is it reliable and valid for high school students? So make sure that it's reliable and valid not only as an instrument, but for your population of study, population of interest. And then here, I wanted to talk a little bit about the value of developing a pilot study. A pilot study is a mini study that is not actually utilized in your actual study to test out your methodology, procedures, etc. And in doing so, we can do this brief investigation to try out what it is that you're going to do in your main study. So let's say you have a survey. Let's pick, instead of surveying 100 people, let's just survey 5 people. And then give them that survey and see how it goes. Maybe we thought it was a 10-minute survey and it really took them 30 minutes. And now we can't take 30 minutes of class time, and so the feasibility has gone down. So it can help us determine, the feasibility of our study. It can help us to determine if our instructions are clear, because then we can ask people, so how, did you understand the instructions? How could we improve it? And in my classes where students actually conduct research studies, I always have them do this pilot study, and it's so informative because it helps you, and especially with the instructions, making sure the instructions are clear. A lot of times in a pilot study, we'll discover that we need to reword instructions. The way in which we worded it doesn't make sense to our audience, and we need to restructure it accordingly. Make sure that there aren't any biases. Make sure that if page 1 of your survey influences page 2, make sure they can't see page 1. anymore. All of these little nuances that don't seem like a big deal when you're developing it, but once you actually test it out, they come across as really influencing how people respond, and we need to deal with those. And so instead of conducting our study with 100 people right away, we can test it out, figure it out with a smaller group, and then fix those problems before we start our actual study. And then finally, we want to think about ethical issues. We want to be sure that we protect our participants from any harm. We always want to think about, can this participants benefit from the study? So one of the things that you need is to establish what's called informed consent. Participants must be 18 years or older to be able to establish consent, or else they need a parent or guardian to consent, and then they need to do what's called assent. But really, we want to know, are they protected from harm? Are there benefits that outweigh any risks? And then when we're done with our study, we should debrief them. Okay, so participation must be voluntary and informed. So even though you don't need to give them your hypothesis, you need to tell them what they're going to be asked to do. So if you're going to do a survey for the study, you'll have to complete a survey. If they're going to be asked to participate in an interview or a focus group interview, all of that must be disclosed to them. Individuals must know that they can decline without penalty. They need to know that they can withdraw. So even if they sign up, get started, they can withdraw. They need to be allowed to do that. Also, participants have a right to privacy. We want to make sure that all of our data is confidential. All names are coded to ensure anonymity so that we cannot then trace those results back to the people from which that data came. So we always want to make sure that nothing is identifiable back to the people from which the data came. And you have to be particularly careful about this. Maybe in a smaller town, you say a college town in South Dakota. Well, there are a very limited number of college towns in South Dakota. We can narrow those down. Maybe within those towns, there's a lot of familiarity, and it makes them more identifiable. So we have to really be careful about protecting participants, especially for things that may make them more vulnerable. And researchers must be honest. Data should be trustworthy, shouldn't fabricate any data, reports should be complete and accurate, and anyone who's contributed to the study should be credited. And research must be reviewed before data collection begins by an internal review board, human subjects board. Every institution has a different name, typically called the IRB or human subjects board, and they will go through any proposal, and these proposals are very lengthy, and you would want to know in depth what are the procedures, in what ways are you protecting your participants, are there any risks, are there great risks or minimal risks? And all of that needs to be really clearly specified to make sure that individuals come out whole at the end of your study, that they're not harmed in any way, and we brought them back to their natural state before they started. So that is the main key point, that no harm is done to our human participants or animals. And then finally, researchers are expected to adhere to a professional code of conduct within their field. And if you just go to the homepage of your own professional organization, whether it's American Psychological Association, Educational Research Association, every discipline, and there are a number of others I know in the course, every discipline has its own ethical procedures. So an institution has ethical procedures and guidelines, like USD has very strict guidelines to adhere to. But even within your own disciplines, there are specific ethical concerns related to the nature of the data that's collected in your discipline. So always be sure to become familiarized with those as well. All right, that is it for this chapter. And on planning your research project.